When I saw my husband whisper in the bride's ear, my world shattered into 1,000 pieces. The groom turned to me with eyes that held secrets I was never meant to know. "Now you know where he goes every week," he said, and suddenly everything made sense in the most horrible way possible. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I am 72 years old. I sit here in my small Brooklyn apartment, wearing the same navy cardigan I've worn for the past 3 years. The fabric is soft from countless washings, like my spirit has become soft from countless betrayals. My hands shake slightly as I fold the wedding invitation that arrived yesterday. The paper is cream-colored, expensive, beautiful, everything I thought my own marriage was. The morning routine never changes. I awake at 6:30 to the sound of garbage trucks rumbling down Atlantic Avenue. The radiator coughs and sputters like an old man clearing his throat. I make coffee in the same ceramic mug my daughter gave me 15 years ago. It has a chip on the handle now. Everything in my life seems to have chips and cracks these days. I water the small plants on my fire escape. They're the only living things that seem to appreciate my care anymore. The geraniums bloom red against the gray brick of the building across the street. Their color makes me remember when life had more brightness in it, when I believed that love was something you could count on, like the sunrise or the subway schedule. My phone sits silent on the kitchen counter. For 23 years, Richard would call me every morning at 8 o'clock, just to say good morning, just to tell me he loved me. The calls stopped coming regularly about 6 months ago. Now I'm lucky if I hear from him twice a week. Yesterday, his mother called instead of him. Again. Her voice was tight, formal. "Eleanor, Richard won't be able to make dinner on Sunday. He has other commitments." Other commitments? As if our marriage was just another appointment in his calendar. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror this morning. The woman looking back at me has silver hair that I keep neat in a small bun. My eyes are still bright blue, though they've seen too much sadness lately. I have laugh lines around them, but I can't remember the last time I truly laughed. The wedding ring on my finger feels loose now. I've lost weight from worry, from not eating when I'm alone, from the constant knot in my stomach that never seems to go away. The invitation sits on my kitchen table like an accusation. It's for the wedding of Sandra Matthews and David Chen. I don't know Sandra Matthews. I've never heard Richard mention her name, but the invitation is addressed to both of us, and it's for this afternoon at 3 o'clock at a small chapel in Park Slope. The weight of all my sacrifices sits heavy on my shoulders this morning. For 45 years, I gave everything to this man. When we were young and struggling in a one-bedroom apartment on the Lower East Side, I worked double shifts at the diner on Houston Street so Richard could pursue his dreams of becoming a photographer. My feet would ache so badly I could barely stand, but I never complained. Love was supposed to be about sacrifice, wasn't it? I remember the night he came home with his first real camera, a Nikon that cost more than I made in 2 months. He was so excited, his eyes bright with possibility. "This is going to change everything for us, Ellie," he said, using the nickname that always made my heart flutter. I smiled and nodded, even though I knew it meant more months of ramen noodles and patched clothes for me. When our daughter Emma was born, I took only 2 weeks off work. We couldn't afford more. Richard was building his portfolio, booking small weddings and portraits. Someone had to keep money coming in. I would come home exhausted, my uniform smelling of coffee and bacon grease, and find him at his desk, surrounded by photographs. He barely looked up when I walked in. "How was your day?" I would ask, bouncing Emma on my hip. "Good. I got 3 new bookings this week." Then he would return to his work, lost in his world of light and shadow, while I made dinner with one hand and held our crying baby with the other. The first time money went missing from our savings account, I thought it was a mistake. $2,000, gone. When I asked Richard about it, he looked annoyed, as if I was interrupting something important. "It was for equipment," he said without looking at me. "I need a new lens if I'm going to compete with the other photographers in the city." "But Richard, that was the money for Emma's school clothes." He finally looked at me then, his expression cold in a way that made my stomach drop. "I'm trying to build something here, Eleanor. This is bigger than school clothes. I bought Emma's clothes at the thrift store that year." She never complained, sweet girl that she was, but I saw how she looked at the other children in their bright new outfits. I worked an extra shift every week for 2 months to make up the difference. The pattern continued for years. Money would disappear. Richard would explain it away with talk of investments, opportunities, necessary purchases for his growing business. And his business was growing. He started photographing wealthy families on the Upper East Side, society weddings in the Hamptons. His name appeared in photography magazines. Our bank account, however, never seemed to reflect his success. Where does the money go? I asked him one evening as we sat in our living room. Emma was 17 then, applying for colleges we couldn't afford. Richard sighed heavily, the way he always did when he thought I was being unreasonable. You don't understand the business, Ellie. There are expenses, networking events, professional development. I have to invest money to make money. But what about Emma's college fund? What about our retirement? There will be plenty of money for all of that once I establish myself properly. You have to trust me. Trust him. I did trust him. I trusted him when he said he needed to work late. I trusted him when he said the weekend workshops were mandatory. I trusted him when he started taking trips to photograph destination weddings, sometimes for weeks at a time. The loneliness crept in so gradually I didn't notice it at first. It was like water slowly filling a basement. By the time you realize what's happening, you're already drowning. Richard's behavior began to change in small ways that I told myself didn't matter. He stopped asking about my day. He would scroll through his phone during dinner, his face illuminated by the blue light while I tried to make conversation. When I mentioned that Mrs. Gutierrez from downstairs had asked about his photography, he would barely acknowledge what I said. He would respond, not looking up. The intimate moments between us became fewer and further between. He would come to bed long after I had fallen asleep and leave before I woke up. On the rare occasions when I tried to initiate physical affection, he would stiffen and find an excuse to pull away. I'm exhausted, Ellie. This business is demanding. I began to feel like a ghost in my own marriage. I would cook elaborate meals that he barely touched. I would buy new clothes or get my hair done, hoping he would notice, but his eyes would slide past me as if I were invisible. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. Was I imagining the distance between us? Was I being too needy, too demanding? Emma saw it before I did. She was home from her first year of college, visiting for Thanksgiving. Mom, she said as we cleaned dishes together, are you and Dad okay? The question hit me like a physical blow. I had worked so hard to hide the cracks in our marriage, to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. Of course, sweetie, why would you ask that? Emma dried a plate slowly, not meeting my eyes. He barely talks to you, and you seem sad all the time? I forced a smile, but I could see my daughter wasn't convinced. Marriage has its ups and downs, Emma. That's normal after so many years together. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. This wasn't normal. This wasn't what love was supposed to look like after decades together. This was something else entirely. The wake-up calls came in the form of microaggressions so small, so seemingly insignificant, that I almost didn't recognize them as cruelty. Richard would make jokes at dinner parties about my appearance, my intelligence, my value as a partner. They were always delivered with a smile, always followed by, just kidding, but they stung like paper cuts. Eleanor never was much of a businesswoman, he would say to his photographer friends. Thank God she knows how to make coffee. The laughter that followed felt like needles in my skin. I would smile along, pretending it didn't hurt, pretending it was all in good fun. But alone in the bathroom afterward, I would stare at my reflection and wonder when I had become someone worth mocking. My 68th birthday passed without acknowledgement. I woke up hoping, as I had every year, that this would be the day Richard remembered how special I was to him. I made his favorite breakfast, wore the blue dress he once said brought out my eyes. I waited all day for him to remember. At 8 o'clock that evening, I finally asked, "Do you know what today is?" Richard looked up from his laptop with annoyance. "It's Tuesday. It's my birthday." The expression that crossed his face was not embarrassment or regret. It was irritation, as if I had reminded him of a chore he had forgotten to complete. "Oh, right. Happy birthday, I guess. I'll make it up to you later." He never did. Christmas that year was even worse. I spent weeks shopping for the perfect gift for him, finally settling on a vintage camera strap I found at a specialty store in Soho. It was expensive, more than I should have spent, but I thought he would appreciate the craftsmanship. His gift to me was a set of dish towels he picked up at CVS on Christmas morning. They still had the price tag on them, $12.99. I held those dish towels and felt something break inside me. Not just my heart, though that was certainly shattered. Something deeper than that. Some fundamental belief I had held about my worth as a human being, about the value of the love I had given so freely for so many years. The final blow came last spring. I had been fighting a persistent cough for weeks, something that rattled in my chest and kept me awake at night. When I finally called to make a doctor's appointment, they told me they had an opening that afternoon, but only if someone could drive me home afterward due to the chest x-rays they needed to take. I called Richard at his studio. He answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted. "What is it, Eleanor? I'm in the middle of a shoot. I need you to drive me to the doctor. They're worried about my cough and they need to do x-rays." Silence. Then, Can't you take the subway? They said I need someone to drive me home afterward in case the sedative they give me makes me dizzy. Another pause. I could hear voices in the background. Laughter. A woman's voice saying something I couldn't quite make out. I can't today, Ellie. This is a big client. Can Emma do it? Emma is in Boston, Richard. She's working. A heavy sigh. Well, I don't know what to tell you. You'll have to reschedule. He hung up before I could respond. I sat in our kitchen, holding the phone, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I was 69 years old, married for 43 years, and I couldn't find one person to drive me to the doctor when I was sick. I took the subway to the appointment and lied to the technician, telling her my husband was waiting for me in the car. I walked home afterward, dizzy from the medication, holding on to building walls for support. It took me 2 hours to travel what should have been a 20-minute trip. The x-rays showed fluid in my lungs, pneumonia. I spent a week in bed, alone, sick and frightened. Richard came home each evening long enough to grab dinner and retreat to his study. He never once asked how I was feeling. That's when I started paying closer attention to where the money was going. Our joint checking account received regular deposits from Richard's photography business. Substantial amounts, larger than I had realized, but the money never stayed in the account for long. Transfers of $500 here, $1,000 there, $2,000 to something called SM Photography Services. When I looked up SM Photography Services online, I found nothing. No website, no business registration, no phone number. I began keeping a notebook, tracking every deposit and withdrawal. The pattern that emerged made my hands shake as I wrote. Over the past 2 years, Richard had transferred nearly $50,000 to SM Photography Services. Our retirement account had been depleted by almost $30,000. Money I had contributed to for decades, money that was supposed to be our security in old age, was disappearing. When I confronted Richard with the notebook, he became angrier than I had ever seen him. "You've been spying on me." His voice was cold, dangerous. "Going through our accounts like some kind of detective? These are joint accounts, Richard. I have every right to know where our money is going. It's business, Eleanor, I've told you that. You don't understand the photography industry. Then explain it to me. What is SM Photography Services?" His jaw tightened. "A contractor. Someone who helps me with editing and client management." "For $50,000? Richard? That's more than I made last year working part-time at the library. If you don't trust me after all these years, then maybe we have bigger problems than you realize." The conversation ended there. Richard walked out of the room and didn't speak to me for 3 days. I learned to stop asking about the money, but I didn't stop tracking it. The morning I discovered the wedding invitation in our mailbox, I thought there had been a mistake. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Morrison were invited to celebrate the marriage of Sandra Matthews to David Chen. I had never heard either of these names before. The address was a small chapel in Park Slope, a neighborhood where Richard often photographed weddings. I assumed it was work-related. Perhaps a bride who wanted us both to attend as guests after Richard had photographed her engagement photos. It wouldn't be the first time, but something about the invitation felt different. The paper was expensive, the calligraphy elegant. This wasn't a mass-produced invitation sent to a photographer's business address. This felt personal. Richard was in his study when I brought him the envelope. He looked at it for a long moment before opening it, and I saw something flicker across his face. Fear? Guilt? I couldn't be sure. "Do you know Sandra Matthews?" I asked. "She's a client," he said without meeting my eyes. "Must want us to attend the wedding." "That's unusual, isn't it? Inviting both of us to a client's wedding?" Richard shrugged. "Maybe she's just being polite." But his hands were shaking as he folded the invitation and put it in his desk drawer. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about Richard's reaction to the invitation troubled me. I had seen him receive dozens of wedding invitations over the years, and he had never seemed uncomfortable about any of them. Most of the time, he barely glanced at them before tossing them in the trash. I got up and crept into his study. The invitation was in the top drawer of his desk, along with several other papers I had never seen before. Bank statements for an account I didn't know existed, receipts for jewelry I had never received, and photographs, dozens of them. They were pictures of Richard with a woman I didn't recognize. She was younger than me, probably in her early 40s, with dark hair and an easy smile. In the photos, they were laughing together, holding hands, looking at each other with obvious affection. In one image, she was wearing a ring on her left hand that looked very much like an engagement ring. At the bottom of the stack was a receipt from a jewelry store on Fifth Avenue, $5,000 for a diamond ring. The date was 3 months ago. I sat in Richard's desk chair, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, and felt something inside me die. Not just trust or love or hope for our future, something more fundamental than that. The person I had been for 70 years, the woman who believed in the power of devotion and sacrifice and unconditional love, simply ceased to exist in that moment. I put everything back exactly as I had found it and went to the kitchen to make tea. My hands were steady as I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. I wasn't crying. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't falling apart. I was just empty. The wedding invitation was for today. 3 o'clock at St. Luke's Chapel on 7th Avenue. Richard had left early this morning, claiming he had a portrait session in Manhattan. He was probably getting ready for his other life, his real life, the one where he was about to marry someone named Sandra Matthews. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. I was wearing a simple black dress and pearls, the same outfit I had worn to my sister's funeral 2 years ago. It seemed appropriate somehow. Today, I was attending another funeral. The funeral of my marriage, my identity as Richard Morrison's devoted wife, my belief that love could conquer anything if you just tried hard enough. The subway ride to Park Slope felt like a journey to another planet. I had lived in New York City my entire life, but today everything looked different. The faces of the other passengers seemed sharper, more real than usual. Colors appeared brighter. Sounds were more distinct. It was as if I had been living in a fog for years and was suddenly seeing clearly for the first time. St. Luke's Chapel was a small, intimate space with stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns on the wooden pews. I took a seat in the back, behind several rows of guests I didn't recognize. The woman getting married was beautiful, just as she had been in the photographs. She wore a simple ivory dress and carried white roses. She looked radiant, the way I had looked on my wedding day 45 years ago. The groom was a distinguished man about Richard's age, with silver hair and kind eyes. He waited at the altar with obvious joy, checking his watch and smiling at guests as they entered. This was David Chen, Sandra's intended husband. But where was my husband? I didn't have to wait long to find out. Richard entered through a side door, dressed in his best suit, carrying his camera equipment. He was the wedding photographer. Of course he was. But as I watched him greet Sandra with a kiss on the cheek that lasted a moment too long, as I saw him touch her arm with obvious familiarity, as I witnessed the way she looked at him with barely concealed affection, I understood that he was much more than her photographer. The ceremony began with a processional piece played on an old piano. Sandra walked down the aisle alone, her eyes fixed on David's face. She was glowing with happiness, and for a moment I felt genuinely glad for her. Whatever her relationship with my husband, she deserved to be happy on her wedding day. David took her hands as she reached the altar, and the minister began the familiar words about love and commitment and forsaking all others. I had heard these words so many times at other people's weddings, had spoken them myself decades ago in a similar chapel in Queens. They had meant something to me then. They had been a promise I intended to keep forever. Richard moved around the periphery of the service, capturing moments with his camera. He was good at his job. I had to give him that. He seemed to anticipate the perfect shot before it happened, positioning himself to catch the bride's smile, the groom's tears of joy, the parents' proud faces in the congregation. But I noticed something else. Every few minutes, Richard's eyes would find Sandra's, even while she was focused on David. And she would smile at him, a small, secret smile that was meant just for the man behind the camera. David never seemed to notice these silent exchanges, but I saw every one of them. When the minister asked if anyone objected to this union, the chapel fell into the traditional moment of silence. No one spoke. David and Sandra exchanged rings and kissed, and the congregation erupted in applause. Rice flew through the air as the happy couple made their way back down the aisle. I remained in my seat as the chapel emptied around me. Richard was packing his equipment, and Sandra was accepting congratulations from her guests. David was shaking hands and accepting backslaps from his friends. It was a perfect wedding, exactly the kind that would generate beautiful photographs and happy memories. But then Sandra broke away from her receiving line and approached Richard. She said something to him that I couldn't hear, then stood on her tiptoes to whisper in his ear. Whatever she said made him smile in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was the smile he used to save for me, full of intimacy and shared secrets. David noticed the exchange and walked over to join them. He clapped Richard on the shoulder and said something that made all three of them laugh. Then David turned and scanned the chapel, his eyes landing on me. I should have looked away. I should have pretended to be interested in the stained glass windows or the flower arrangements. Instead, I met his gaze directly, and something passed between us. Recognition, understanding, sympathy. David walked down the aisle toward me, his new wife's hand in his, Richard trailing behind them. As they approached my pew, David's expression grew serious. "You must be Eleanor," he said quietly. "Richard's wife." I nodded, not trusting my voice. David glanced at Sandra, then back at me. When he spoke, his words were gentle but clear enough for Richard to hear. "Now you know where he goes every week." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face drained of color. Sandra's smile faltered. I felt the final piece of my marriage crumble into dust. I'm sorry, David continued, his voice still soft but firm. I thought you knew. I thought you had agreed to this arrangement. I looked at Richard, waiting for him to explain, to deny what David was implying, to give me some reasonable explanation for why his lover's husband thought I was aware of their relationship. But Richard just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. How long? I asked. My voice sounded calm, which surprised me. Sandra spoke for the first time. 3 years, she whispered. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I thought Richard told me you two had divorced. He said you were just friends now, that you stayed married for financial reasons. 3 years. While I had been tracking mysterious bank transfers and wondering why my husband seemed so distant. While I had been making his favorite meals and buying him thoughtful gifts and worrying about his health and happiness. While I had been lying awake at night, missing the intimacy we used to share and blaming myself for not being more attractive, more interesting, more worthy of his attention. The money, I said, still speaking directly to Richard. SM Photography Services. Sandra Matthews. Richard finally found his voice. Eleanor, I can explain. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than I expected them to be. You've been paying for her photography business, supporting her while she built her career, using our retirement money to fund your girlfriend's dreams. She's not my girlfriend, Richard said desperately. We're business partners. She helps me with editing, with client management. Sandra made a small sound of protest. Richard, don't. She deserves the truth. David put his arm around his new wife's shoulders. Sandra and I have been separated for 2 years, he said to me. We're getting remarried now because we worked things out. But during our separation, she and Richard, they became close. Close, I repeated. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. I love him, Sandra said simply. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I know that doesn't make any of this right, but I want you to know that what Richard and I have is real. It's not just about money or business or convenience. I looked at this woman who had been sharing my husband for 3 years, who had been accepting money that should have gone toward my medical bills and Emma's student loans and our future together. She was beautiful and successful, and obviously beloved by 2 different men. I should have hated her, but I found that I didn't. How could I hate someone for loving Richard? I had been doing the same thing for 45 years. Does he tell you he loves you? I asked her. Sandra nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Does he remember your birthday? Does he call you every morning just to hear your voice? Does he come with you to doctor's appointments and hold your hand when you're scared? Yes, she whispered. Then you're getting something I haven't had in years. I picked up my purse and walked past the 3 of them toward the chapel door. Congratulations on your marriage, Sandra. I hope it works out better than mine did. Richard called my name as I reached the exit, but I didn't turn around. I had nothing left to say to him, and I doubted he had anything left to say that I wanted to hear. The subway ride home passed in a blur, but when I emerged onto Atlantic Avenue, the world seemed different again. Not clearer this time, but smaller somehow. More manageable. The problems that had seemed so complicated an hour ago now felt remarkably simple. I climbed the 3 flights to our apartment and began packing Richard's belongings. His clothes went into suitcases. His photographs went into boxes. His equipment stayed in his study. That could be his problem to deal with later. I worked methodically, without emotion, like someone preparing for a move to another city. By evening, everything that belonged to Richard was stacked neatly by the front door. I changed the locks, something I probably should have done years ago when I first suspected he was having an affair. I opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion and sat in my living room, surrounded by sudden space and unexpected quiet. The phone rang at 8 o'clock, Richard's daily call, right on schedule. I let it ring until it stopped, then unplugged the phone entirely. He came home around 10 o'clock. I heard him trying his key in the new lock, then knocking on the door. Eleanor? Eleanor, open the door. We need to talk. I stayed in my bedroom with the television turned up loud enough to drown out his voice. After an hour, he stopped knocking. I heard him gathering his belongings from the hallway, the suitcases and boxes I had packed for him. Then his footsteps retreated down the stairs, and I was alone for the first time in 45 years. I didn't cry that night. I didn't rage or scream or throw things. I didn't call Emma to tell her that her father was having an affair and that her parents' marriage was over. I didn't compose angry letters to Richard or Sandra or David. I just sat in my quiet apartment, drinking wine and thinking about how much space there was now that one person's worth of belongings had been removed. The next morning brought phone calls I chose not to answer and text messages I deleted without reading. Emma called from Boston, having heard from her father that he was staying with a friend for a few days while we worked things out. I told her the truth, gently but completely. She cried. I comforted her. Then I made myself breakfast and began planning my new life. The divorce papers were easier to obtain than I had expected. New York State had simplified the process in recent years, especially when adultery was involved and the guilty party didn't contest the proceedings. Richard's attorney called to discuss property division and spousal support. My attorney, a sharp woman named Margaret Chen who specialized in late-in-life divorces, informed Richard's team that I wanted exactly half of everything we had accumulated during our marriage, including his photography business, plus damages for the money he had transferred without my consent. You could get more, Margaret told me during our second meeting. Punitive damages for emotional distress. We could go after his current income, not just the marital assets. I don't want more, I told her. I just want what's fair. Are you sure? He put you through hell, Eleanor. He stole from you. I thought about that for a moment. Richard had stolen from me, but not just money. He had stolen years of my life, my sense of self-worth, my belief in the power of unconditional. But more than that, he had stolen my ability to trust my own instincts, to believe that I deserved honesty and respect and basic human decency. I want what's fair, I repeated. Nothing more, nothing less. The settlement took 3 months to finalize. I received half of our savings, half the value of our apartment, and half of Richard's photography business. The amount was substantial, more money than I had ever controlled independently in my entire life. Richard had been more successful than I realized, and our assets had grown considerably over the years despite his secret transfers to Sandra. More importantly, I learned that I was entitled to Social Security benefits based on my own work history, not just as Richard's spouse. The part-time jobs I had worked throughout our marriage, the years I had spent contributing to our household income while Richard built his career, had value that I had never fully appreciated. I used part of my settlement to buy a small apartment in Park Slope, not far from the chapel where I had watched my marriage finally die. It was a one-bedroom with large windows and a small garden in the back. For the first time in my adult life, I lived in a space that was entirely my own, decorated according to my tastes, organized around my schedule and my needs. Emma visited me there for Thanksgiving, our first holiday without Richard. We cooked together, just the two of us, and talked about things we had never discussed when her father was around. She told me she had always known something was wrong between us, that she had spent her teenage years trying to make both of us happy, playing mediator in a conflict she was too young to understand. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said as we cleaned dishes together in my new kitchen. "I know this must have been terrifying, but you did the right thing. I should have done it years ago," I admitted. "I wasted so much time trying to save something that was already dead." "You weren't wasting time. You were being loyal. That's not a character flaw, Mom. It's just that some people don't deserve loyalty." That winter, I did something I had never done before. I took a class. Not a cooking class or a gardening class or something practical that might benefit Richard or our household. I took an art history class at the local community college, something I had always wanted to study but never felt I had time for. The other students were mostly younger than me, but not all of them. There were several women my age who had decided to pursue interests they had set aside during their caregiving years. We became friends, bonding over our shared experience of discovering who we were outside of our roles as wives and mothers. One of these women was named Patricia. She was 74, recently widowed after a long marriage to a man who had controlled every aspect of her life. She was taking classes in literature and philosophy, reading books her late husband had told her were too difficult for her to understand. "I'm not sure who I am anymore," she told me one day over coffee after our art history seminar. "I spent 50 years being Harold's wife. Now that he's gone, I don't know what my purpose is." I understood exactly what she meant. For most of my adult life, my identity had been tied to taking care of Richard, supporting his dreams, managing our household around his needs and schedule. Without that role, I felt unmoored, but also, unexpectedly, free. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," I suggested. "Maybe this is our chance to figure out who we were supposed to be all along." Patricia smiled. "You sound like someone who's figured it out." I hadn't. Not entirely. But I was beginning to understand that figuring it out was going to be the most interesting project of my life. Spring brought news that Richard and Sandra had married in a small ceremony in the Catskills. Emma told me about it when she called for her weekly check-in. She had been invited but chose not to attend. "Are you okay with it?" she asked carefully. I considered the question seriously. 6 months earlier, the news would have devastated me. Now it felt like information about strangers, interesting but not particularly relevant to my life. "I hope they're happy," I said. And I meant it. Not because I was feeling particularly generous toward Richard, but because their happiness was no longer my responsibility. For the first time in decades, I was responsible only for my own happiness, and that felt like a gift rather than a burden. That same spring, I did something else I had never done before. I traveled alone. I booked a week-long trip to Santa Fe, someplace I had always wanted to visit, but Richard had never shown interest in. I stayed in a small bed and breakfast, took a pottery class, visited art galleries, and hiked in the desert. On my last day there, I sat on the porch of my bed and breakfast, watching the sun set over the New Mexico landscape, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, but a deep sense of rightness about where I was and who I was becoming. I called Emma that evening to tell her about my trip. "You sound different, Mom," she said. Lighter somehow. "I feel different," I admitted. "I feel like myself again. Or maybe like myself for the first time. I'm glad. You deserve to be happy." After we hung up, I sat on the porch for another hour, thinking about deserving. For so many years, I had believed that love was something you earned through sacrifice and service, that happiness was selfish unless it was shared, that my needs mattered less than everyone else's needs. Now I was beginning to understand that deserving wasn't something you earned, it was something you were born with, like the right to breathe or dream or take up space in the world. I deserved honesty from my spouse. I deserved to have my contributions valued. I deserved to be treated with respect and kindness. I deserved to pursue my own interests and dreams. I deserved to be happy. When I returned to New York, I made another decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I sold the apartment in Park Slope and bought a small house in Woodstock, about 2 hours north of the city. It had a large garden and a studio space where I could paint, something I had always wanted to try but never felt I had time for. Emma was initially concerned about my moving so far away from her, but when she visited me in my new home, she understood why I had chosen it. "It feels like you here, Mom," she said as we sat in my garden, surrounded by flowers I had planted myself. "This house feels like the person you're becoming." I was becoming someone, that much was true. Someone who woke up each morning excited about the day ahead instead of dreading it. Someone who made decisions based on her own preferences rather than trying to anticipate what would make other people happy. Someone who had learned that solitude was different from loneliness, that independence was different from isolation. I started painting that fall. Terrible paintings at first, but mine. My colors, my subjects, my mistakes and discoveries. I hung them on the walls of my house, something I never could have done when Richard lived with me. He would have made subtle comments about wasted space and amateur efforts that would have crushed my fragile artistic confidence before it could develop. Now I painted for hours each day, losing myself in the process of translating the world around me into color and shape and light. It didn't matter whether the results were good or bad. What mattered was that I was creating something with my own hands, expressing something that came from inside me alone. Patricia came to visit me that winter. She had decided to pursue a master's degree in philosophy at the age of 75. Her children thought she had lost her mind, but she was happier than I had ever seen her. "Harold used to tell me I was too old to learn new things," she said as we sat by my fireplace, drinking wine and watching snow fall in my garden. Imagine if I had believed him. Imagine what I would have missed. I thought about all the things I had missed during my marriage. Not just the obvious things, travel and education and artistic pursuits, but smaller things too. The simple pleasure of reading a book without interruption, the satisfaction of making decisions without having to justify them to someone else, the joy of discovering what I actually liked and disliked when I wasn't trying to accommodate another person's preferences. "Do you miss it?" Patricia asked. "Being married?" It was a question people asked me often, usually expecting me to say that I did, that despite everything I missed the companionship and security that marriage provided. The honest answer was more complicated than that. "I miss the marriage I thought I had," I said finally. "I miss the partnership I believed we were building together. But I don't miss the actual day-to-day reality of being married to Richard. I don't miss feeling invisible and undervalued and taken for granted." "Do you think you'll marry again?" I laughed, surprising myself. "God, no. Why would I want to do that again?" "Not all men are like Richard," Patricia pointed out. "Maybe not, but I've spent 45 years taking care of someone else. Now I want to take care of myself." That didn't mean I was opposed to companionship. I had made several close friendships in Woodstock, including a friendship with a man named Thomas who taught pottery at the local art center. Thomas was a widower, kind and funny and undemanding of my time and attention. We enjoyed each other's company without any pressure to define our relationship or make it into something more than it was. "I like having someone to go to movies with," I told Emma when she asked about Thomas during one of her visits. "But I like coming home to my own house afterward even more." Emma smiled. "You've become very wise, Mom. I've become very selfish," I corrected. And it turns out that's exactly what I needed to be. 2 years after my divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call from Sandra. She was calling to tell me that she and Richard were getting divorced. Apparently, their marriage hadn't been the fairy tale romance she had imagined it would be. "He's not a bad person," she said carefully, "but he's not capable of the kind of partnership I thought I wanted. He's too self-centered, I guess. Too focused on his own needs to really see mine." I listened without comment, feeling neither satisfaction nor sympathy. Richard's marriage to Sandra was no longer my concern, just as my marriage to Richard was no longer hers. "I wanted to apologize to you," Sandra continued, "for my part in what happened. I knew he was married when we started seeing each other. I told myself you didn't love each other anymore, that your marriage was just a legal formality. But I knew that wasn't really true. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you." "Thank you," I said simply. "I appreciate your apology. Are you happy now?" she asked. "I hope you're happy." I looked out the window of my studio, where I could see the garden I had planted and the easel where my latest painting waited for me to return to it. My life was smaller now in some ways, but infinitely larger in others. "I'm happy," I told her, and meant it completely. After we hung up, I went back to my painting. It was a landscape of the mountains that surrounded my new home, but I was painting them in colors that didn't exist in nature. Purples and oranges and deep blues that captured something about how the mountains made me feel, rather than how they actually looked. It occurred to me that this was what I had been trying to do my entire life without realizing it. I had been trying to paint an accurate portrait of love and marriage and family, using only the colors I thought I was supposed to use. But love isn't always soft pastels and gentle earth tones. Sometimes it's fierce reds and electric blues. Sometimes it's the black of walking away from something that's hurting you. Sometimes it's the bright yellow of discovering that you can be perfectly complete all by yourself. That evening, I called Emma to tell her about Sandra's phone call. "How do you feel about it?" Emma asked. "Like it has nothing to do with me," I said honestly. "Their marriage was never really about me, and their divorce isn't either. I've got my own life to think about now. I'm so proud of you, Mom. When this all started, I was scared you would fall apart. Instead, you've become this incredibly strong, independent person." "I was always strong and independent," I corrected her. "I just forgot for a while." As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the woman I had been 3 years ago. The woman who had sat in a Brooklyn apartment, tracking mysterious bank transfers, and wondering why her husband seemed so distant. The woman who had attended a stranger's wedding and learned that her marriage had been a lie for years. That woman had been so afraid of being alone that she had accepted loneliness as the price of staying married. She had been so afraid of being unloved that she had settled for being taken for granted. She had been so afraid of being selfish that she had never asked for what she needed. I didn't miss that woman, but I felt compassion for her. She had done the best she could with the tools she had been given. She had believed what she had been taught about love and sacrifice and what women owed to their families. She had been loyal and devoted and selfless, all qualities that should have been virtues but had become weaknesses in the hands of someone who was willing to exploit them. Now I was someone different, someone who understood that love without respect isn't really love at all, someone who knew that sacrifice without appreciation becomes martyrdom, someone who had learned that the most radical thing a woman my age could do was to put her own needs first. I still believed in love. I still valued family and commitment and loyalty, but I believed in them on my own terms now, with boundaries and expectations that reflected my own worth rather than my willingness to accept whatever was offered to me. 3 years later, on a bright Saturday morning in October, I was working in my garden when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked up to see Emma getting out of a rental car, followed by a man I didn't recognize. She was smiling in a way that told me this was someone important to her. "Mom," she said, walking over to give me a hug, "I want you to meet David." David was a professor at Emma's university, a kind-eyed man about her age who shook my hand warmly and complimented my garden. Over lunch, I watched the way he looked at my daughter, with obvious affection and respect, and the way she looked at him. This was what love was supposed to look like, I realized. Partnership instead of ownership. Mutual support instead of one-sided sacrifice. "We're engaged," Emma told me as we cleaned up after lunch. "I wanted you to meet him before we made any official announcements." I hugged her tightly, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. "He seems wonderful, sweetheart. Does he make you laugh?" "Every day," Emma said, her face glowing. "Does he support your dreams? Does he treat you like an equal partner?" "Yes, Mom, to all of it." "Then I couldn't be happier for you." That evening, after Emma and David had driven back to the city, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, thinking about the cycles of love and marriage and family. Emma was beginning a journey that I had completed, but she was beginning it with so much more wisdom than I had possessed at her age. She knew her own worth. She understood what she deserved. She wouldn't accept less than she was worth just to avoid being alone. The phone rang as I was getting ready for bed. It was Richard, calling for the first time in over a year. His voice sounded older, more tired than I remembered. "Eleanor, I heard about Emma's engagement," he said without preamble. "It's wonderful news," I said neutrally. "I was hoping we could go to the wedding together, as a family." The request didn't anger me the way it would have a few years ago. It just seemed sad, this attempt to recreate something that had never really existed. "Richard, we're not a family anymore. We haven't been for a long time. We have a daughter together. We have a history together. We have Emma together," I agreed. "And I'm sure she'll want both of us at her wedding. But we'll be there as her divorced parents, not as a reunited couple." There was a long pause. "Are you happy, Eleanor? Really happy?" I considered the question seriously. Happiness seemed too small a word for what I felt these days. I was content. I was fulfilled. I was free. "Yes," I said simply. "I am. I'm glad," Richard said, and I thought he might actually mean it. "I know I hurt you. I know I was selfish and dishonest. I'm sorry for that." "Thank you for saying that," I said. "I forgive you, Richard. Not for your sake, but for mine." After we hung up, I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking locks. This house that was entirely mine, decorated with my paintings and filled with my books, and organized around my schedule and my needs. This life I had built from scratch at the age of 72, when most people my age were settling into their final routines. In my bedroom, I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me had silver hair that I wore loose around my shoulders now, instead of pulled back in a tight bun. My eyes were still bright blue, but they held a confidence that hadn't been there during my marriage. I had laugh lines around them, earned from genuine laughter with friends who appreciated my sense of humor. I was 75 years old, divorced, living alone in a small town where I knew no one when I arrived. By most conventional measures, I should have been pitiable. A woman who had failed at the most important job society had assigned to her, keeping her husband happy and her marriage intact. Instead, I felt like the luckiest person in the world. I had learned that it's never too late to start over. Never too late to discover who you really are underneath all the roles you've been playing for other people. Never too late to demand respect and kindness and honesty from the people in your life. Never too late to walk away from situations that diminish you, even if walking away means walking alone. Most importantly, I had learned that being alone and being lonely were completely different things. I had been desperately lonely during my marriage, surrounded by someone who didn't really see me or value me or appreciate what I brought to his life. Now I was alone by choice, surrounded by people who cared about me and activities that fulfilled me and a sense of my own worth that no one could take away from me. Emma's wedding was beautiful. She and David were married in a small ceremony in Central Park, surrounded by friends and family who clearly adored them both. I wore a dress I had chosen myself, a deep blue that brought out my eyes, and I felt genuinely proud to be Emma's mother, to have raised a daughter who knew how to choose a partner, who would cherish rather than diminish her. Richard was there, of course, with his camera, photographing his daughter's wedding with obvious pride and love. We spoke politely, but briefly, like the distant relatives we had essentially become. I felt no anger toward him anymore, but also no nostalgia for what we had once shared. That part of my life was over, and I was grateful for the lessons it had taught me but ready to focus on what lay ahead. At the reception, I danced with Thomas, who had driven down from Woodstock to be my date. We had been seeing each other for 2 years now, a relaxed courtship that involved shared interests and mutual respect, but no pressure to combine our lives or compromise our independence. "You look beautiful," he told me as we swayed to music played by a small string quartet. "I feel beautiful," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of it. "What's your secret?" I thought about it as we continued to dance. I stopped trying to be what other people needed me to be. I started being what I needed me to be. And what's that? Honest, independent, uncompromising about my worth. I smiled at him. "Turns out those are all attractive qualities." Thomas laughed. "Indeed they are." Later that evening, as I was preparing to leave the reception, Emma pulled me aside. "Thank you, Mom," she said, tears in her eyes. "For what, sweetheart?" "For showing me what it looks like to choose yourself. For teaching me that I deserve to be treated well. For proving that it's never too late to start over." I hugged my daughter tightly, thinking about the gift I had inadvertently given her by refusing to accept less than I deserved, by watching me leave her father, by seeing me build a new life based on my own terms. Emma had learned lessons about self-worth and self-respect that I had taken 70 years to understand. "I love you," I told her. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become." "I learned from the best," she said. As I drove back to Woodstock that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this place. 4 years ago, I had been a woman who defined herself entirely through her relationships with other people. A wife who had lost herself so completely in her husband's needs that she had forgotten she had needs of her own. A mother who had taught her daughter, through example, that women should accept whatever love was offered to them, no matter how inadequate or disrespectful. Now I was a woman who lived alone by choice, who pursued her own interests, who surrounded herself with people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could do for them. I was someone who had learned that self-respect wasn't selfish, that boundaries weren't walls, that saying no to what you don't want is the only way to make room for what you do want. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been nights when the silence of my house felt oppressive rather than peaceful. There had been moments when I questioned whether I was making the right choices, whether I was throwing away security for the sake of pride. There had been well-meaning friends and family members who suggested that I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too demanding. But I had persisted, guided by a growing understanding of my own worth and a determination to live the rest of my life on my own terms. And now, at 75, I could honestly say that I was happier than I had ever been. That doesn't mean my life was perfect. I still struggled with health issues that came with age. I still worried about money sometimes, about how long my savings would last. I still missed having someone to share daily experiences with, someone who knew my history and understood my references without explanation. But those challenges were mine to face as I chose, not burdens I had to carry while also managing someone else's expectations and demands. My problems were real, but manageable precisely because I didn't have to solve them while also trying to keep someone else happy. More importantly, I had learned to appreciate the gifts that came with independence. The joy of waking up each morning and deciding how to spend my day based entirely on my own preferences. The satisfaction of solving problems and making decisions without having to negotiate with anyone else. The peace that came from being in a relationship with myself that was based on honesty and respect and genuine affection. I still believed in love, but I believed in a different kind of love now. The kind that enhanced rather than diminished the people involved in it. The kind that was based on choice rather than need, on mutual respect rather than mutual dependence. The kind that made both people stronger and more themselves, not weaker and less distinguishable from each other. I wasn't sure if I would ever find that kind of love with another person again, and I was okay with that uncertainty. I had found it with myself, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. As I pulled into my driveway and looked at the small house I had made into a home, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Even the painful parts, even the betrayal and the loneliness and the fear. All of it had been necessary to teach me what I was worth, what I deserved, what I was capable of creating for myself. I thought about the woman who had sat in a Brooklyn apartment 4 years ago, tracking bank transfers and wondering why her husband seemed so distant. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her that her instincts were correct, that she deserved better than what she was accepting, that it's never too late to start demanding respect and honesty and genuine love from the people in your life. But I would also tell her that she was stronger than she knew, that she had everything she needed to create a beautiful life, even if it wasn't the life she had planned. That being alone was not the same as being abandoned, that starting over was not the same as giving up, that choosing yourself was not the same as being selfish. Most of all, I would tell her that the best years of her life were still ahead of her, waiting to be discovered and claimed and fully lived. As I prepared for bed in my quiet house, surrounded by evidence of the life I had built from scratch, I felt a deep sense of completion. Not the kind of completion that comes from finishing something, but the kind that comes from finally becoming who you were always meant to be. I had spent 70 years learning how to love other people. Now I was spending my remaining years learning how to love myself with the same devotion and commitment I had once given so freely to others. It was a different kind of love, but it was no less valuable, no less worthy of celebration. I fell asleep that night thinking about tomorrow, about the painting I wanted to finish and the book I was reading, and the garden that would need attention as the weather grew colder. Simple pleasures, but entirely my own. A life that was smaller in some ways than the one I had shared with Richard, but infinitely richer in the ways that mattered most to me. In my dreams, I was young again, standing at the altar of a small chapel in Queens, promising to love and honor and cherish. But this time, I was making those promises to myself, and I knew I would keep them for the rest of my life. The morning sun streaming through my bedroom window brought with it a sense of possibility that had become my daily companion. At 75, I was living proof that transformation doesn't have an expiration date, that courage can bloom at any age, that the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. I stretched in my comfortable bed, chosen by me, for me, and smiled at the day ahead. There were paintings to create, friends to see, gardens to tend, books to read. There was a life to be lived fully, consciously, joyfully. My life, the one I had finally learned to claim as my own. Standing at my kitchen window with my morning coffee, I watched the sun rise over the mountains that surrounded my chosen home. In the distance, I could see Thomas working in his pottery studio, beginning his own day with the same quiet satisfaction I felt. We would probably meet for dinner later, two independent souls choosing to share an evening without losing themselves in the process. This was what I had learned in the years since that devastating day in the chapel: that love doesn't require surrender, that partnership doesn't demand sacrifice of self, that the strongest relationships are built between whole people who choose to enhance each other's lives rather than complete them. I raised my coffee mug in a small toast to the woman in the mirror, to the journey that had brought me here, to the courage it had taken to walk away from a life that looked right from the outside but felt wrong from within. I had learned to love myself with the fierce protectiveness I had once reserved for others, to guard my peace as carefully as I had once guarded my marriage, to value my own happiness as much as I had once valued Richard's comfort. The phone would ring soon, Emma's weekly call, filled with updates about her marriage, her work, her growing understanding of what it meant to be a woman who knew her worth. My daughter had learned by watching me claim mine, just as I had learned by watching my mother sacrifice hers. The cycle, finally, was broken. Outside my window, the world was waking up to another day of infinite possibilities, and for the first time in my 75 years, I was fully awake to meet them. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you gave everything to someone only to discover they were living a double life? Have you ever had to choose between the security of an unhappy relationship and the uncertainty of starting over? Tell me your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It helps me continue sharing these difficult but necessary truths about love, loss, and the courage it takes to choose yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for allowing me to open my heart to you.